The influence of media on behaviour has been an issue for a very long time. This issue has been with us since the idea that rock music was going to cause bad behaviour in the 60s, to heavy metal music causing Satanism in the 80s. Current hot button issue is, do violent computer games create violent behaviour? And that's the specific issue being looked at in the paper that we're reviewing today. Today we're going to be looking at Ferguson and Olson, video game violence used amongst vulnerable populations, the impact of violent games on delinquency and bullying amongst children with clinically elevated depression or attention deficit symptoms. So there is continued academic debate on whether violent games lead to violent behaviour. Ferguson and Olson suggest that there's a tendency amongst authors to allow their own biases to colour their interpretation of their data, and also that the measures used don't always reflect real-world behaviours. They give an example of the sort of task where someone might complete a violent game and then have to complete a spelling task and be given the letters K-I and be asked to finish a word, finishing with double L implying a violent behaviour, double S not violent. Does this reflect real-world violence? Mass shooting incidents in particular have caused an interest in, do mentally ill people have a specific vulnerability to this sort of influence? And so that's the specific population that's being looked at in this paper. This article is relevant because it's attempting to specifically define both the behaviours as delinquency and bullying, and the population as a population of children with mental illness symptoms. The specific hypothesis is that children with depression or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder symptoms, as measured on the paediatric symptom checklist, will have a positive correlation between the amount of hours they spend playing violent games and the amount of self-reported delinquency and bullying behaviours they display. Participants were 377 children with a mean age of 12.93. There were 182 with ADHD symptoms, 284 with symptoms of depression, 89 with both, 234 female, 140 male, and 3 with no gender reported. This was a correlational study. They used a self-report version of the paediatric symptom checklist to measure the levels of depression and ADHD symptoms. The attitudes towards conflict scale was used to measure trait aggression. The stressful urban life event scale was used to measure general life stress, and parental involvement and support from others was measured on a Likert scale survey developed for this study. Entertainment software board ratings were used to determine the level of violence in the games being played. Children were asked what games they played and how many hours per week they played them, and then the authors checked the ESRB ratings of each game and double-checked that those ratings were issued due to violent content. The delinquency scale was a 6-question Likert scale derived from a series of other questionnaires that have existed previously in delinquency studies, and bullying was measured with the revised Olson bully victim questionnaire. The data were collected at the school with no teachers or parents present. Only 6.1% of participants reported no exposure to games. 11.4% reported no exposure to violent games. Within the group with elevated symptoms of depression, no correlation was detected between violent game playing and bullying and delinquency. There was a correlation between elevated life stress and trait aggression and antisocial behaviour. For children with ADHD symptoms, no relationship was found between delinquency and violent games. A relationship was found between bullying and violent games. They found that more violent game playing actually led to lower levels of self-reported bullying. The best predictors of delinquency were once again stress and trait aggression. So for this particular study, we have a null hypothesis. Children with symptoms of ADHD or depression did not display higher levels of delinquency or bullying with increased exposure to violent games. So the implication of this is that there is no particular reason to limit game playing in this population if you are concerned about increased levels of violent behaviour. And there was actually a finding where bullying behaviour may decrease, possibly due to some sort of cathartic effect. The authors themselves suggest that this is a limited study with a limited sample size, and therefore to take this result very carefully and not to, just run with it without further examination. So what were the limitations of this study? Children were screened for symptoms of mental illness via a self-report questionnaire, but they were not formally diagnosed. Therefore, these results have to be interpreted with caution if we're to look at applying them on a formally clinically diagnosed population. And this actually gives us an opportunity for further study where we could look at children with formal diagnoses of depression or ADHD and see if a similar sort of effect occurs amongst them. Most participants were also regularly exposed to violent gaming, and is it possible that you would get a different result if you had a comparison control population with no exposure to violent gaming? Now, self-report measures were also used for all of the study. This may lead to issues where the children may not have been reliably self-reporting their behaviour, and therefore we have to be a little bit cautious about the idea that they might be underreporting the level of game playing or underreporting their level of bullying or delinquency. Obviously, you can imagine children might have a motivation to underreport bullying and delinquency. One opportunity for further study would be to look at an institution where they can track levels of delinquency and bullying and compare that to self-reported game playing. Overall, this study represents an interesting look at the field of whether violent gaming increases violent behaviour, but does have enough limitations that we must interpret the data with caution and use them as a springboard for further study rather than seeing them as a conclusion in and of themselves.